My name's Jules Pidduck. I'm speaking to you from Montreal in Quebec in Canada. Um, I am an associate professor at Université de Montréal. I used to teach at Lancaster University many years ago. And I'm interested in visual culture and questions of gender and sexuality. This presentation is going to be based on an ongoing project that I'm doing that's called After Images and Urban Spaces with several collaborators here in Montreal. And the project looks at questions of visual culture in relation to questions of space and place, particularly for LGBTQ histories of Montreal. So I'm going to do my best here to I'm going live here, so just to make sure that I get my technology working. Here we go. So you should be able to see a PowerPoint presentation. Can you see that? Yes, I see. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's go. I'm going to just put on my timer. Whoops. Okay. So this is the paper is called After Hours Chez Madame Arthur, Staging a 1970s Lesbian Bar. And I'm going to talk about an installation that I curated in summer 2019, where we restaged a rather famous lesbian bar from the 1970s, a Montreal lesbian bar that was called After Hours, that was called actually Chez Madame Arthur. So this gives you a bit of an idea of what the installation looked like. And you've got my contact details there. So I'm going to just maybe give a little bit of background. Here I have a quote from Gail Rubin, who talks about the complicated process of forgetting and remembering lesbian history. And Rubin talks about the way that different generations of lesbians and queer women have kind of sought to seek out the histories of their forebears. And the book cover that you see on the right side of the screen is a book by one of my colleagues who I esteem very much, Lynn Chamberlain, who did some very important oral history with lesbians who were out and about in the city of Montreal in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So in a sense, it's my homage to Lynn and some of the other people who've done this foundational work based on oral histories and documentary research that gives me a kind of a springboard to talk about my project of research creation that took the form of an installation. So this installation that we did was made really based on oral histories, based on some more recent interviews, and other archival traces of this bar that was called Chez Madame Arthur. So I chose Chez Madame Arthur. That was one of several bars that were very active and popular at the time. This bar in particular is really well known, kind of legendary amongst Montreal lesbians and queer women. Because of it has a sort of certain cultural cachet. For one, there was a book, a novel that was written by Marie-Claire Blais, who's an important Québécois writer, that's called Les Nuits de l'Underground, a novel that was published in 1978 that was based on and written from this bar. So it's sort of, there's a certain glamour attached to this bar as a place where Marie-Claire Blais and her friends hung out. And this image that I have here is an image that was made by her lover, Mary Meggs, who you might know, who's also a writer. That was her kind of impression of the space where they used to hang out in the early 70s. And I show this image partly because it was it's the only visual trace that I've been able to find of the bar, and that raises the kind of core point of the lack of traces of lesbian bars, partly because they were so ephemeral, and also importantly because people didn't want their pictures taken. It was a very much a clandestine scene here in Montreal, as it was elsewhere. Chez Madame Arthur, as a choice for kind of the bar that my installation was based on, is also really well known for a notorious police raid and boycott in 1974. So from in the post-war period, and certainly before the post-war period that's less documented, police raids were very common in these bars, as they were elsewhere. And there was quite a well-known raid on Madame Arthur in 1974 that was sparked by a straight male client who was cruising a lesbian, one of the lesbians in the bar, and her girlfriend decided to beat her up, beat up the guy, and the police was called in, and so on and so forth. So this is quite a famous event, and I think what makes that raid particularly important for lesbian history in Montreal is the fact that some of the clientele of Chez Madame Arthur, they actually organized a boycott afterward to protest the kind of male control of the space. And although the boycott was not successful, it still marked the imagination of the lesbian communities here. So to give you a little sense of the ambiance, the feeling of the installation, I'm going to play a short extract I made these audio montages. So it's a series of excerpts of interviews and readings from particular texts that were woven together that people could listen to, and they were set up at the bar. And this will give you an idea, a little bit of the sound of the installation. So what we have here is you'll hear a little bit in French, where one of the respondents is talking about her memories of the bars of the 60s and 70s. And then we'll have an excerpt from a lesbian publication of 1971 called A Long Time Coming, where my colleague Julie Podmore reads this kind of description of what Madame Arthur was like. And it was sort of the fanciest and the most popular bar at the time. So here we go.
En tout cas, elle, il y avait plus de mélange de monde aussi. Mais disons que le plus, entre guillemets, fancy, c'était Madame Arthur.
Madame A's. Even the name sounds different. When you say it, you get the feeling that you're on your way either to a brothel or a gypsy fortune teller. It's a bit of both, but mostly the most popular bar in Montreal. The women who go there are younger, more inclined to be radical feminists and super dykes. The student, the would-be students, the models, pimps, call girls, fancy dressers, and every goddamn civil servant in the city make up the rest of the clientele.
Et puis c'était plus...
Okay, that was just a short excerpt. I hope you could hear it all right. I'm going to go back into my PowerPoint now. Excuse me for the confusion. And so this was gives you a little bit of the sound of the exhibition. Certainly there were some images, and I'll show you in a minute some of the different aspects of the exhibition, but I want to maybe just set up some of the thoughts that I've had since the exhibition finished in the next slide, to think about what it was that we were doing. And before I go a lot further, I want to talk about how important this process of research creation was. I'm usually someone who writes academic papers and so on, but this was my first stab at what we call research creation. And in order to make this installation happen, I worked with a number of different collaborators, including, most importantly, Kimura Nathalie Lemoine Biol, who worked as assistant curator, And Kimura is an artist and was a really important collaborator. But there were a lot of different people, technicians, artists, activists who really helped me out on this. And what I saw was the way that the community kind of came together around this project, which was really exciting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I've thought about this exhibit that includes a number of different archival traces, and they're all very partial, very fragmented bits and pieces, people's memories, excerpts from novels and interviews. We have really very little that's left of the bars, of the bar scene of the 60s, 70s, and even the 1980s here in Montreal. And after the exhibition was over and we'd torn it all down, I was really bummed out, of course, to see the end of it, but also I started to think about what it was that we'd been doing. And I started thinking about the way that we'd chosen this particular bar and bits and pieces of ephemera from the period and different kinds of media texts as a kind of a metonymic project where Chez Madame Arthur works as a kind of a metonym that stands in for the bars of that period. The bars being a super important place where queer women and lesbians would meet up. And so then I started to think about what is the power of a metonym, because what you have is just a small bit of something much larger. And I look back to Susan Stewart's work where she writes about metonymic objects as providing desired and needed souvenirs of events that are reportable, events whose materiality has escaped us. The possession of the metonymic object is a kind of dispossession, as the overvalued experience of the object speaks to the absence of an original, authentic event or experience. So there it's to sort of talk about the overvalued importance of, say, the shape of the beer bottles at the time, or the ashtrays that some of the former clients remembered, and that I went to find the ashtrays of the period, that they were big and they were heavy and they were squarish and they were made out of glass. So in a sense, to think about the power of the metonymic period objects, but also metonymic media traces, which is what I'll talk about in the next few slides. So I began to think about how this exhibition operated as a kind of a metonym.
If I
Yes.
could just interrupt you for a moment. The screen you're sharing has a file window blocking the PowerPoint presentation.
Oh no, how's that? How did that happen?
It happened on the last slide. So I'm going to.
Okay, hang on a sec. I'll have to end it and start again. Whoops, that shouldn't be there. Okay, well, I'm going to go back to this screen. Whoops. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. Here was the previous screen. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to jump to the next slide. So we keep this idea of the metonym, or the partial object, the partial media trace in mind. And I wanted to just mention that I was able to obtain a certain number of bar images taken by my friend and longtime acquaintance, Suzanne Girard, who's a photographer who worked in the lesbian feminist community for years. She didn't have any photos of Chez Madame Arthur, but she did have some photos of bars from the early 1980s, including the photo on the right is an image of Denise Cassidy, also known as Babyface, who is a very well-known figure, a former wrestler who worked in the bars for years. So in a sense, I had a certain number of these photos that were not photos of Chez Madame Arthur, but they stood in for the missing photos or the missing images that I didn't have. And I was delighted to be able to collaborate with Suzanne, who showed some really extraordinary photographs, many of which I can't share with you because she didn't get the permissions. So there were images, and the images were an important part of the project. The other thing is, if you imagine an installation, we started with a white cube, small white cube gallery, and there was nothing in it at first. For me, this was, I wondered how on earth I could find enough stuff to fill it up to make an interesting exhibition. But we had fortunately had the photos, Suzanne's photos. We also had, what I did was I built a bar using bits and pieces from different warehouses and so on, a bar that sort of evoked the feeling of the 1970s. And we painted a strip in the corner. This was Kimura's idea, and that created like a little bit of warmth that the bar was based in. And the bar became a sort of a magnet for visitors. And there were stools around the bar that people could sit on. And I'd found all of the different bottles of spirits and beer and soft drinks of the period, and an old, you can see the objects there. So it was sort of a place where people could sit, and often we would chat with the visitors there, or they would chat there, and they would listen to the audio montages, and you heard a short excerpt earlier. So there was a kind of a warmth in that, and that made me think of the power of these metonymic objects that kind of bring us back in time, or seem to suggest a certain authenticity, although of course there is no actual authenticity. There's the metonymic kind of stand-in there. Okay. And so as I begin to wrap things up, or as I wrap things up, there's a lot of things I could say about this installation. I mentioned earlier how I was really amazed and quite moved by the response from different queer, women's, lesbian, trans communities, younger folk, older folk, the people who'd been to the bars, and younger folk who were desperate, really keen to know more about that history. It kind of brought people together, and that was really really interesting for me as someone who usually writes texts, writes academic texts. And I was reading Kate McKinney's wonderful recent book that's called Information Activism, where she writes about the work of archival work, reading, researching, writing, publishing, communicating, and archiving as tactics marginalized users adapt and adopt to imagine and enact transformative modes of counter-public address. They are discursive and self-organizing processes for circulating information through which strangers with something in common come into relation. So there was something of that kind of performative quality of the installation that brought people together and generated, even very temporarily, new connections, sparked new connections, created the possibility of new collaborations. And I thought this was particularly interesting in a present moment where there are no designated lesbian or queer women's spaces, or at least not permanent ones, in Montreal as elsewhere. And the idea of this exhibition as a kind of as a provisional and very much an ephemeral space where queer women and lesbians of different ages, different political stripes could gather, and people were able to kind of commingle, the people that normally would not be in the same room together, and they were kind of drawn into the different media elements. And I found that was really interesting in terms of creative approaches to LGBTQ pasts, the way that certain kinds of research creation maybe can open up spaces or different kinds of spaces for people to meet up, to remember, to ask questions, and so on. So I'm running out of time here. Here are a few references very briefly, but I guess I would just say that this is a very small and humble project that I really very much enjoyed doing, and that some of the collaborations and the connections that began with this project are ongoing. And I've got some more projects with collaborators, particularly Kimura, Nathalie Moine, Biol, that are coming up soon. And that's the end of my time.